All right, welcome back, everybody. AP Environmental Science. This is Unit 9, Topic 9.7, which is kind of the last really big topic that we have to cover in this unit um, that deals with global change. It's this topic called ocean acidification. So, just kind of getting started here, what is ocean acidification? It's kind of right there in the name, right? It's the acidification of ocean water. It's a decrease in the pH. Remember the pH scale. This is something that you do have to know for the AP exam. You have to know that the AP or that the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. Again, 7 is neutral. It gets more acidic as you go towards 0. All right. So, if you start at 14, which is considered extremely basic or alkaline, as you go down the scale, you get more and more acidic. So, what's happening right now is ocean water is becoming more acidic. It is actually undergoing a decrease in pH. Now, do remember that the pH scale is logarithmic. So, a change in one value of pH, let's say from 7 to 6, that represents a 10 times, or that represents a power of 10 as far as the change goes. So this would be 10 to the first, 10 to the second, 10 to the third, etc. Compared to let's say 10 to the or compared to pH of 7. So there is a logarithmic change to the actual scale. During the last 200 years, ocean pH has dropped from 8.2 to 8.1. Now that may not seem like it's that big of a deal, but that is a 30% change in acidity based on the fact that again, the pH scale is logarithmic. So it is kind of a really big deal, that slight change from 8.2 to 8.1. Now, the reason why oceans are becoming more acidic is it's basically a direct link to greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide. The more CO2 that we have in the air, the more CO2 gets absorbed into the water. So again, the more greenhouse gases that go up into the atmosphere, we're talking specifically CO2 here, there will be more CO2 in ocean water. There's a direct link there. And we know that CO2 gets into the air by burning fossil fuels, either from vehicle emissions or coal power plants, and also deforestation. Those are the major ways that CO2 gets into the air. Make sure you know both of those for the AP exam. So if we're putting all this CO2 into the air, it's going to get into the oceans no matter what. Now, a little bit of chemistry here that we do have to kind of understand. I'm going to kind of walk you through this. It's not really that difficult as long as you know some formulas and recognize some very simple chemical reactions. So what happens when carbon dioxide gets into the ocean? Well, take a look here at this first equation. Okay, what this is showing us is carbon dioxide combining with water. So that's what happens, right? When CO2 gets into the water, in this case, it's producing something called carbonic acid. Now, just that alone, think about that. I mean, if CO2 gets into water and it's producing an acid, you would expect the pH of water to decrease, and that's kind of exactly what it does. But to be a little bit more specific, what happens to this carbonic acid? Whenever it's in water, strong acids like this one, they dissociate, they kind of break apart. In this case, it turns into what we call a hydrogen ion and what we call a bicarbonate ion. Bicarbonate is HCO3, and it has a negative charge to it. So again, just to kind of review this, CO2 in water produces carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid dissociates and breaks apart into these two things. Now, the hydrogen ions, those are the actual things that actually increases the acidity, or I should say decreases the acidity, causes it to become more acidic in the ocean. So the more of those hydrogen ions there are, the more acidic ocean water is actually becoming. Now, one of the things that is kind of, I'm not going to say abundant, but one of the things that's kind of necessary for a lot of marine organisms is a compound called calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate, which has the formula CaCO3, this is a compound that's found in the ocean and is used by organisms for a variety of reasons. Clams, oysters, and snails use calcium carbonate to make their shells, which are very important for protection, and it's kind of like a little home for those organisms. Also, corals, picture on the right here, corals use calcium carbonate to make their skeleton. It's kind of their reef building structure. So as the reef grows, they produce more and more of this calcium carbonate. So it's very essential to these types of organisms. Now, in order to make calcium carbonate, these organisms have to have two ions. They have to have calcium, which is very abundant in the oceans. We're not going to run out of calcium ions. And the other one is carbonate. Now, carbonate is also an ion that is found in the oceans in great abundance, but there's a problem with carbonate ions anytime you have ocean acidification. It says here that hydrogen ions that are produced by ocean acidification, so remember that those two equations that I showed you, right? We get those hydrogen ions that are produced. What happens when you get an excess of those hydrogen ions in the water, and we do get that when carbon dioxide gets into the water, is they end up bonding to those carbonate ions. They end up bonding to the very ion that is needed by some of these marine organisms in order to make their shells. So when this ion whenever it bonds to hydrogen ions, it produces something called a bicarbonate ion. Now, here's kind of the overall reaction that sort of happens, and this is kind of what I want you to really know. On the left here, let's think about ocean water, right? So H2O, right? Here's our water. So when carbon dioxide reacts with that water, and there's carbonate ions in the water, which there are carbonate ions, that's going to produce bicarbonate. Now, bicarbonate is a molecule that marine organisms can't really use it to build their shells. They prefer to use this ion. The problem with this ion is it's now being converted over to bicarbonate because all of that carbon dioxide is in the water. So essentially, what's kind of happening here is the ions that are needed by these organisms are being used up. They're no longer available for organisms to make their shells or for corals to make their skeletons. And this is really, really bad. So, I mean, when CO2 gets into the water, then we have a total disruption of marine ecosystems because a lot of these organisms are part of the food chains. So, kind of the effects of ocean acidification here on some of these organisms, especially for mollusks, things like snails and clams, is again, there's less carbonate ions that are available for them, so they can't build their shells. And the oceans are becoming more acidic, so whatever shells that they do have, they're actually disintegrating and dissolving because of the acidic conditions. So there's kind of two major problems here that are being caused by carbon dioxide getting into the water. It's using up their carbonate ions and it's causing acidic conditions. And that's kind of a double problem here for some of these animals. The other thing here with corals, and we've talked a little bit about corals before, but corals, same thing. There's less carbonate, so they're not going to be able to build their skeletons properly. So that the corals are not going to be able to grow. That's becoming a real big issue. And remember that corals live sort of in a symbiotic relationship with algae. They live with a plant. So anytime we have conditions, for example, let's say that the oceans are becoming more acidic, that's going to affect the algae. The algae don't like it when it becomes too acidic, so they may just escape, and they may not want to live anymore symbiotically with those corals. Also, understand, we talked about this yesterday, there's less sunlight due to ocean levels rising. So as ocean levels rise, less sunlight can penetrate down, and those algae won't be able to photosynthesize. So that's a problem. And then finally, today we talked about changes, um, in water temperature. As the oceans get warmer, then that could create conditions for these algae that they can't exist in, and they could die off. So, understand that there are a lot of different factors that are affecting this symbiotic relationship with these algae and the coral. And global warming, you know, caused by greenhouse gas emissions, it causes all of these problems for corals. Coral reefs are in major, major trouble, and it's not just because of one thing. Like a lot of people think it's just because the temperature is changing. Well, it has a lot. There's a lot more to it than that. Acidic conditions, against sunlight, and also changes in water temperature. So make sure we know. I would say at least two of these reasons for the AP exam. All right, guys, that is it for me for today. Take care, and I will see you soon.